title of our message this morning, Job chapter 31, verses 1 through 40, Job's ninth and final speech, part 6 of 6. I know this is a very lengthy text, and it can be very confusing. But if we split it up into small parts, it's really easy to follow the context of what's going on. Here in this morning's text, Job concludes his ninth and final speech with a final cry of his innocence. Job had presented a sunny picture of his past in chapter 29. He presented a very gloomy picture of himself in chapter 30. And now here Job makes one final appeal of his innocence. The text is lengthy, but it breaks up into 12 very clear sections. In each of these sections, Job declares his innocence of 12 particular sins, which are, and I'll give them to you in the order, verses 1 to 4, lust. Then in verses 5 to 6, the sin of deceit. And then in verses 7 to 8, the sin of greed. Then in verses 9 to 12, the sin of adultery. Then in verses 13 through 15, any injustice he might have felt towards slaves. In verses 16 to 23, the charge of hard-heartedness towards the poor. In verses 24 and 25, any trust that he might have had in his possessions or his gold. In verses 26 or 28, he defends against the charge of false worship. In verses 29 through 30, he defends against the charge of hating his enemy. In verses 31 and 32, against the charge of inhospitality. And then verses 33 and 34, against the sin of insincerity. And finally, after a plea to God to listen, he defends himself against the worst of these sins, I guess, an exploitation of the land in verses 38 through 40. The three friends and the townspeople had probably accused Job of these particular sins. That's probably why he chose these sins to defend, and we'll look at each of these sins briefly. We start with verses 1 to 4, in which Job defends himself against the sin of lust. Verse 1 to 4. I made a covenant with mine eyes. Why then should I think on a maid? For what portion should I have of God from above? And what inheritance of the Almighty from on high? Is not destruction to the wicked, and strange punishment to the workers of iniquity? Doeth not he behold my ways, and tell all my steps? Here in these 4 verses, Job begins to set out the principles by which he lived. Job means to show in each of these 12 sections that he expects to be judged rightly by God by his actions. But Job argues that he lived beyond his actions, as we're called to do by the law. He went even deeper than his actions in his desire to avoid sin. Job says that he went beyond just the appearance of acting righteous and even suppressed any inward desires that might have, by chance, led to some even deeper sin of the mind. For example, here in verses 1 to 4, he takes as evidence his sexual desires, which he has, he said, suppressed. I want you to notice throughout the text he keeps saying, if I did this, if I did that. He didn't do it. He's just saying, if I did it. And there's a difference. He has made, it says, a covenant with his eyes, or forbidden himself to look upon a woman with lust. By governing the first cause, the sight, or by reining in his first emotion, he hopes to avoid the greater sin, inclining his mind to it. Job reasons that if he repressed even an impulse that could just possibly lead to sin, how much more would he have been careful to avoid any deliberate act of wrongdoing? Verse 1. Job says the reason that he was so particular about avoiding sin was due to his knowledge that God is always present, and due to God's providence and his judgments to govern and to punish sin. Verse 2. Next, Job asks in verse 3, so what can a man expect from God if he should act in this fashion? The fashion of repressing the first sin so that it didn't break forth into worse transgressions. Job's answer was that he expected God to be good to him for his righteous actions. But Job says that is not what he has received. Is it not strange, Job asks, that God rewarded me instead with destruction? Job has come to believe the wicked would be punished, but not the righteous. Verse 3, and he wonders aloud whether God has observed his righteous ways and tell all his steps, or been attentive to the way he's been walking so righteously. Verses 5 and 6, in which Job addresses the charge of deceit. If I have walked in vanity, or if my foot hath made haste to deceit, let God weigh me in the just balance, and he shall know mine uprightness. Job says that if he has dealt with his neighbor with any kind of vanity or deceit, which of course includes lying or falsehood is misrepresenting the truth deliberately, defrauding or hypocrisy, he says, then let God judge me now. That's what he means by weigh me in the just balance. And search my actions, says Job. Job is certain that he will be found innocent. And God, rather than punishing him, would be a witness to his sincerity in living a blameless life. Job desires vindication from God personally. But he also, for his friend's sake, wants God to declare him innocent. Job insists that he be weighed by God in just or fair scales or just balances. Job wants to share from the portion of the righteous, like his actions deserve, not the wicked. Job implies that if God looked closely or more closely, he would find Job to be innocent of any deceit. The third sin that he was accused of, that he defends himself against now, is the sin of greed. Verses 7 and 8. If my step hath turned out of the way, or mine heart hath walked after mine eye, or if any blot hath cleaved to my hands, let me sow and let another eat. Yea, let my plants be rooted out. Job here uses the language of the Psalms when he refers to the manner in which he walks as his steps. He says he has not turned out of the way of the path of the righteous. Of course, the path is the written law of God. In these verses, he's speaking of the lust for money, or gold. We can identify that he speaks of money because of the curse that he calls down upon himself in verse 8, which we'll look at briefly. I want you to understand that when he talks about mine heart, the heart in Scripture is the seat of intelligence. Like we might think of the brain. You know, in our culture we think of it as the seat of the emotion, but when you're reading the Bible, it's the seat of intelligence. Here it says that Job did not allow the eye, where greed first enters into the body, to affect his heart, which means his mind. Job recognized what harm the mere act of looking can do, and makes an honest claim that he intercepted the passion of the eye before it could settle in his mind and give birth to the love of wealth in his mind. Job stopped the first hint of sin in its tracks, so as not to destroy the soul. Job decries a death curse upon himself in verse 8 if he's guilty of this crime. If he has ever harmed his neighbor based on his love for money, here's the curse. Job says that if he has ever defrauded a neighbor, let me sow and let another eat. In other words, let me never be rewarded by my own labor, but let another man reap the rewards and gather my crops for himself. Verse 9 through 12, Job defends himself against the charge of adultery. If mine heart, think mine, hath been deceived by a woman, or if I have laid wait at the door of my neighbor, let my wife grind, that means labor or work, unto another man, and let other men bow down upon her. For this is a wickedness and iniquity to be condemned. Yea, this is a fire that shall devour to destruction, and which shall root out all mine increase. Job speaks again here of his heart, meaning his mind, declaring his innocence of the sin of adultery. Job here imagines that if he had ever fallen into that sin, which he has not, he says, if mine heart hath been deceived by woman, or stalked his neighbor's wife. That's what he means by, if I have laid wait at the door of my neighbor. Then he talks about what great punishment he deserves. Job imagines the worst kind of punishment. He does not imagine the punishment even falling upon himself, which would be understandable. He imagines far worse. His punishment would fall upon his innocent loved ones, in this case his wife. Now, let me clear this up. A lot of people have pointed to this and they've said, well, why should Job be punished for his own sins? Well, I think anyone who has a dear loved one knows that we would rather be punished ourselves for our sins, and it would be far worse of a punishment to have to see others, our children, our wives, have to suffer for our doing. And that's what Job's talking about. He's saying, far worse for my loved ones to be punished for what I did than for me. If you and I get punished for what we do, we deserve it. We can live with that. But we cannot live with someone have to suffer for what we do. And that's what's going on here. Okay? A lot of commentators messed that up this week. None of the good ones. On we go. If, says Job, I did such a thing, a fit punishment would be watching my wife serve as both a slave, that means grind, refers to the act of working, and possibly be used as a concubine by her master. That was common practice, customary. Let other men bow down upon her. Job also, and this is only found if you compare the Hebrew, is comparing the sin of adultery to the sin of incest or prostitution, which of course is far worse violations of the seventh commandment. The Hebrew use of the word translated wickedness here, or crime, throughout the Old Testament scriptures refers to the sin of incest and prostitution, such as it does in Leviticus 18:17 and chapter 20, verse 14, as well in Judges chapter 20, verse 6, and Jeremiah chapter 13, verse 27, something we lose in the English translation. Job notes that his adultery would be a sin so wicked that he likens it to a fire that shall devour to destruction, or a fire that could burn down Sheol. And furthermore, he deserves to have all his possessions taken away, he's told. Mine increase. If I'd done the sin of adultery, I deserve to have all my possessions taken away. Once again, though, Job is declaring himself innocent of the sin of adultery. His fifth of 12 sins that he accepts as criticism, but he defends against, injustice towards servants, verses 13 through 15. If I did condemn the judgment of my servant and of my maid when they did contend with me, what then shall I do when God standeth up? And when he shall visit me, what shall I answer? He that hath made me in the womb, hath not he made him? Hath not he alone fashioned us in the womb? Once again, Job argues for his innocence, now in his protection and care of his servants. Apparently someone may charge him of mistreating his servants. Job argues that he never withheld justice to his servants. Many servants, as we know, are often abused, for they lack any legal recourse. But Job accepted his servants as equals on the scales of human justice in man's court. Job believed that all men had a right to be treated after God's moral law and so judged. Here Job imagines a scenario in which he has fictitiously wronged a servant. He has, it's fiction. And they have come to contend or complain to him. Job asks, if I acted that way, am I not completely aware that my actions would be observed by God when God standeth up, says the text, or judgeth me? Job asks two more questions in verse 15. Hath he not made us both in the womb, and fashioned us the same in the womb? Both which ask aloud if all men are not made and stand equally before God. Job believed that since all humanity has been created by God, what God has fashioned with great care must be treated with great care and respect by God's other creatures. Next, Job defends himself against the hard-heartedness towards the poor, verses 16 through 23. If I restrain the poor of their desire, have caused the eyes of the widow to fail, or have eaten my morsels alone, and the fatherless hath not eaten thereof. For from my youth he hath grown up with me as with a father, and from my mother's womb I have been a guide unto her. If I have seen any perish for want of clothing, or any poor without covering, if his loins have not blessed me, because he has worn with the fleece of my sheep, If I have lifted up mine hand against the fatherless, when I saw that I might help him in the gate, let mine arm fall from my shoulder, and mine arm be broken from the bone. For God's punishment was fearful unto me, and I could not be delivered from his highness. Again, here Job is speaking hypothetically. He says, if. In fact, this section contains 4 ifs, followed by a self-curse if he has broken this law. Job says that if he had caused someone to become poor by his doing, and caused them to look for sustenance in vain and without hope, and if he has deprived the fatherless of bread and not been a guide to the orphan, and if he has ignored or refused warmth to the poor, which he didn't, he said he clothed them with the wool of his own sheep, or refused to help the destitute, then let him lose his arms. Job's curse of himself is related to this hypothetical evil action. If Job has done all or any of these things at any time, if Job has refused to use his arms to work, or his arms to help, or his arm of the law, he was a judge, or his arm of power to do good, and he's failed to do it, then it follows his arms have no use, for they were created to help and not to hurt. Therefore, a fit punishment for a man who refuses to use his arms as his power to help is to have the power of his arms taken from him. Our 7th charge, that Job trusted in his possessions, verses 24 and 25. If I made gold mine hope, or have said to the wedge of gold, thou art my confidence. If I rejoiced because my substance was great, or because mine hand had gotten much. Here in these verses, Job condemns the act of placing one's confidence in wealth, or giving ourselves credit for our own wealth, not praising God for it. Because Job, of course, is a rich man, he has much gold. Interestingly, you never hear that he lost his gold. You hear he lost his cattle, his children, but it never says he lost his gold. Interestingly, he surmises that the townspeople might assume that his sin was to put his trust in wealth. And since they were accusing him of loving his gold, it kind of tends to reason that he might have still had it. Job argues that God alone is the only appropriate hope for humans. Proverbs 3:26 and Psalm 78:7. Job imagines the foolishness of having a personal relationship with a block of gold, in the same manner that we'd have a personal relationship with God. Is ludicrous. Job declares that gold isn't his confidence. Thou, God, he says, art my confidence, not my wealth. The next point is related. He's accused of false worship. Verses 26 to 28. If I did behold the sun when it shined, or the moon walking in her brightness, if mine heart did flatter me in secret, or if my mouth did kiss mine hand, this also had been an iniquity to be condemned, for I had denied the God above. Another sin, similar to the previous sin of putting one's trust in gold, is to place one's confidence in the heavenly bodies, or having more reverence for the sun and moon than for our Creator, the worship of nature. Worship of the sun and moon has always existed, and it existed prevalently in Job's day. So common throughout the Old Testament was the sin of worshiping the sun and the moon that it is thoroughly condemned throughout the entire canon of the Old Testament. In Deuteronomy 4 and 17, in 2 Kings 21, in 23, in Jeremiah chapter 7, in Zephaniah 1, in Ezekiel 8. Obviously it kept coming up and God had to keep warning against it. Job may have been enticed about worship of sun and moon, as millions also have. But ultimately he suppressed, he said, his first inclination and decided that to worship the heavenly bodies and to give them glory is to deny God above. Job compares the enticing nature of natural religions to a young man being infatuated with a young maid. Notice the language he uses. The person in the text falls in love with the moon like a young man might fall in love with a young woman. She walks in her brightness. His heart is secretly moved. He even imagines kissing her by kissing his hand. But that, as so many men are enticed like a young man for a young woman, so the devil, of course, entices us into false religion and idol worship. His final phrase is particularly interesting. If my mouth did kiss mine hand refers to the actual practice of the heathens who in sun and moon worshipped, kissed their hand, would throw a kiss their hand and throw a kiss from their hand. That was a very important gesture used in the worship of the sun and the moon by the Samaritans and the Babylonians and the Assyrians in their false nature religions. Job has not, he said, even been secretly enticed into the worship of this false god or false worship. We come to his ninth defense, his defense that maybe he has hated his enemy. Verse 29 and 30, if I rejoiced at his destruction that hated me, or was moved to joy when evil came upon him, neither have I suffered my mouth to sin by wishing a curse unto his soul. Loving one's neighbor is, of course, required by the law. It's the final 6 commandments, and it's part of the common Israelite morality, Leviticus 19:18. Included in this love is forgiveness of our neighbor. The law even encourages showing compassion to our enemy in Exodus chapter 23, verses 4 and 5. But Job goes even beyond that. He not only shows his enemy compassion, he treats his enemy as a neighbor. Job has followed the rule of Proverbs 24:17. Do not rejoice when your enemy falls, and let not your heart be glad when he stumbles. Job means to say that he has never rejoiced over the troubles of his enemies. He has never allowed his mouth to utter a curse upon his enemy's soul. Job's argument here is from less to worse. He's saying that if he did not even wish a curse upon his enemy, the common practice of most, how is it likely that he went further and rejoiced at the evil that came upon his enemy? He cannot, he says, be charged with hating his enemy. Our 10th charge, that Job was inhospitable, or the charge of inhospitality, which you know is more important in those days than in ours. Verses 31 and 32. Did not the men of my tabernacle say, who shall give us of his flesh? We cannot be satisfied. The stranger did not lodge in the street, but I opened my doors unto him that went by the way. Loving the stranger is also required by the law, Leviticus 19:34, moral law. Perhaps Job was charged with committing this crime that was considered common hospitality. Job not only showed hospitality, but afforded his guests, we're told, the best of his food. Flesh to eat, which is meat, normally is set aside for rare festive occasions, as we see in 1 Samuel 25:11 and 1 Kings 1:19. But strangers found by Job, they were given his best meats. The peak of generosity was, of course, to kill the sheep in honor of guests. At Job's table, there could have been lamb or beef on the menu every day of the week. After all, he had 7,000 sheep and 1,000 oxen. Job entertained guests after the manner of his ancestor, Abraham. The stranger here mentioned, also called a sojourner, is not native born. He's usually nothing more than a passerby who plans on settling down for the night and moving on to the next town in the morning. And it would be very easy to mistreat someone you would likely never see again. But Job says, I opened my doors unto him that went by the way. And so Job, he says, cannot be charged with the crime of being inhospitable to the stranger. We come to our 11 of 12 charges, verses 33 of 34. If I have hid my sin, as Adam, concealing my iniquity in my bosom, though I could have made afraid a great multitude, yet the most contemptible of the families did fear me. So I kept silence and went not out of the door. Difficult task. I relied on Matthew Poole for this one. This is straight from the hand of Matthew Poole. The charge of insincerity. Job again says, if I have hid my sin, in which he admits to being a sinner, he objects to the charge, though, that he is a secret and scandalous sinner. He sins worse than he's said he sins. Job makes reference here to Adam and refers to the fact that Adam sinned. After Adam sinned, he hid from God out of shame. Adam pretended nothing had changed in his status after he knew he'd wrongfully eaten from the fruit. His attempts to hide his iniquity from God were, of course, futile. for God knows everything. And so Job says the same. He did not hide his sin from God or man. But especially he did not hide his sin from God because he knows that God sees all. In verse 34, Job amplifies and confirms his integrity. Job says he never covered or concealed his sin because he was afraid of the great multitude. In other words, the fear of shame or contempt from men never hindered Job from confessing his faults before men, which we're required to do. Job did not act over piously or ever attempt to hide his faults. Job says that if he really were a secret sinner or a hypocrite, then he would have remained silent in his house while all this destruction hit him, and not so vehemently here now protested his innocence. Job argues that sins he quickly revealed. In the past, he's quickly revealed his past faults. It only reasons that he would now be equally sincere about his innocence. And finally, we come to the last point, but before we do that, there's an introduction to the last point here. In verses 35 through 37, Job makes his final appeal to God to hear him and be his judge and judge him innocent. He says, "Oh, that I had some to hear me. Behold my sign that the Almighty will witness for me, though mine adversary should write a book against me. Would not I take it upon my shoulder and bind it as a crown unto me? I will tell him the number of my goings and go unto him as to a prince." These are the only verses in which Job does not defend himself against a particular charge. Instead, Job makes here his final appeal to God to be heard. Job feels wronged and believes that God owes him an explanation. This is Job's fourth appeal. The other were in chapter 16:19, chapter 19:27, and chapter 23:6, all in this book, to be brought before the court of God. He has no fear of a negative verdict. His final speech is an attempt to force God's hand. Job says that if God would rule and give him a written verdict, he, quote, "would take it upon my shoulder and bind it as a crown unto me." Job believes that he would have no need to whimper over God's written verdict. Let's make sure we understand that the verdict isn't his imperfection sins. The verdict is the charges that people have been charging him with. He's innocent of those charges, not all sin, of course. He will go public with it. In Job's mind, the verdict would be blank. He would take this verdict without charges and he would announce it to the entire world, openly displaying it day by day for the entire world to see that God has no scandalous charges to bring against Job, and that he was innocent all along. His not guilty verdict, he says, he would wear like a crown. He would present himself before God like a prince, meaning he would enter the presence of God with his head held high, approaching God with assurance of his innocence of any scandalous sin, and without fear of blame. And finally, the final charge. "If my land cry against me, or the furrows thereof complain together, if I have eaten the fruits thereof without silver, or if I have grieved the souls of the masters thereof, let thistles grow instead of wheat, and cockle in the stead of barley." The words of Job are ended. This idea of exploitation of the land. Quite interesting. Job returns to complete his list of 12 offenses he may have been accused of, each of which